What's the worst risk you've ever taken? Back in college I was obsessed with this girl named Tiana. She was the sweetest person I knew. She also had a rump that had literally started a fight one time we went out with a group of our friends. She was built like a photoshopped bowling pin. The bunda was ridiculous. We were in the same major and shared a few classes. Eventually we started a little study group and would share answers to homework assignments through a group chat. Then that turned into talking every night and walking around campus until sunrise. We quickly became best friends. Eventually, I put my feelings aside and decided that it was better if I never told her that I was interested in her romantically. I was fine with just going on walks every night. One of our friends in the study group, Dylan, invited us to his house in Delaware. I texted her and asked if she was going and she told me that she needed to talk to me. I picked her up at her place and she confessed her feelings for me. We started dating the next morning. 2 weeks after that, we found ourselves in rural Delaware with 3 other guys from our study group. I had been to Wilmington a few times. I was expecting Dylan to be in some sort of suburban setting. Identical houses, stucco finishing, that sort of thing. His house didn't have any of that. He lived on a wide street that hadn't been paved in years. There were houses all along the street but each one had a distinct characteristic. One had gnomes in the front yard, another looked like a junkyard with auto parts and rusty cars strewn about. It was strange. A new environment for sure. To top it all off, Dylan's house was on the edge of a forest. He told us that he used to wander in those woods all the time when he was in high school. Once everyone was settled into his place, he asked us if we were cool with one of his childhood friends coming by to hang out with us. He seemed really excited about seeing his worlds collide, so of course we told him it was okay. We were in the middle of an Uno game when Dylan got a call. He left the table and came back with a 6 feet 2 inches stocky bearded man he introduced as George. For whatever reason, Dylan called his mom by her first name, so I figured this Viking looking dude in khakis and Nike Monarchs was his father. Of course, this was his childhood friend he mentioned earlier. He introduced himself again to everyone at the table. I don't know if it was his stature or something about the way he shook Tiana's hand, but his presence made me uneasy. The whole vibe of the Uno game switched up when George sat down. This guy would not stop talking about weapons. He had started a business selling gun parts that he would make himself to people on the internet. He talked about how easy it was to acquire and own a weapon without having to worry about the law. We asked him only half jokingly if he had a gun on him at that moment. He told us he wasn't strapped up tonight. Then he pulled out the wildest knife I've ever seen from a little sheath in his waistband under his shirt. It looked like something Bear Grylls would use to cut open a bear to sleep in. I think Dylan could feel everyone getting a little tense, so he suggested we go for a walk in the woods behind his house. Tiana and I had been split up by Dylan's mom. We were in a conservative household with no obvious opportunity to do some progressive things to each other on our own. I had no intention of going into the woods with someone that was pretty obviously a serial killer in the middle of the night. So, when Dylan asked, I hesitated and started to say that I was okay with staying before I caught a quick elbow to the ribcage from Tiana. I got on her wavelength and realized this may be our only opportunity to get some freaky time to ourselves. So, off to the woods we went. After about 10 minutes of moving deeper into the woods, George says, I could really kill all of you if I wanted to right now. Why would he say that? If I wasn't certain before about George being a Hall of Fame threat to our collective safety, I was now. The group laughed it off. Dylan had told us to turn our phone flashlights off because our eyes would adjust to the dark and we'd have a wider range of vision. He was right, but I could not see anything for those first few minutes. We all continued walking the trail. Dylan had told us earlier that it was a big loop that would take us all the way back to his house at the end. We were about halfway when someone realized that George was no longer with the group. Dylan assured us that George was just trying to prank us. He told us that he had probably felt the tension from the group and decided to play into the character. I didn't want to hear it. I'm no fool. When the crazy guy with a knife that said he was going to kill us all just vanishes into the night, I'm not sticking around to find out if he was just being silly. I start walking back toward where we came from. I turned my flashlight back on because my eyes refused to adjust for some reason. Everything was gray in the night. Everything in my peripheral vision looked like a face or an arm or a body waiting to snatch me up. I was paranoid. I thought about turning back when I heard footsteps in quick succession coming up from behind me. I froze like a deer in headlights because I didn't want to risk running and falling. I figured I stood a better chance if I held my ground and fought. I turned around, prepared to die. It was just Tiana. She grabbed me by the arm and pulled me off the trail. I won't lie. I had forgotten all about the business with Tiana in light of the current situation. When she pulled me in for a kiss, I waged an internal battle. I could risk it for the biscuit and get busy in these dark woods with a killer on the loose. Or, I could tell Tiana that we had to hold off and get back to the house so that we survived the night. You already know I had to risk it. She had that Kyle Lowry. That Mrs. Incredible. This was no ordinary biscuit. This biscuit was life-changing. We made out for about 2 minutes before I heard a crack behind Tiana. I opened my eyes and saw a shadow rise above her. I pulled away. I couldn't even muster a noise from my mouth. I think I was in shock. Petrified. Tiana saw my face and turned around. George had his knife raised above his head like Michael Myers. He let out one of those noises you make when you want to scare someone. In that split second I realized that Dylan was right and that he was just trying to scare us. It was messed up, and totally out of line for him to have the knife out, but I knew he wasn't going to stab Tiana. She saw it differently. She didn't care to analyze the tone of voice he used to scare her. She immediately Sparta kicked George in the crotch. She drove her foot in there so hard that I felt it from behind her. I don't know what George was expecting, but I guess it wasn't a rocket to his manhood. He folded and stumbled back a step before slipping on a rock. He started tumbling down a little hill. When he hit the bottom, he screamed out in pain. He had landed directly on the knife. His scream pierced the night. I wanted to leave. After all, he had brought this upon himself. Who would think it's a good idea to scare someone in the pitch black woods with a knife drawn? But before I knew it, Tiana was down there. She yelled back up that if we didn't help George then he could die. She told me to call an ambulance. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, but there was no service this deep into the woods. If we were going to find help, we were going to have to do so manually. I told Tiana to run and find Dylan so that someone could call for help. I didn't want to leave her alone with the crazy guy, even though I would have been faster on foot to get help. I still didn't trust him. While I waited with George, he started talking to me about his dreams. I figured it was good to keep him talking, so I just listened and let him rock. He was getting more delirious with every sentence. Eventually, his words started slurring and I could tell it was taking a considerable effort to get the words out. He had 2 brothers and a sister all raised by a single mom. All he'd wanted to do was provide for them when he got older. He just worked all the time to make his mom's life easier. Dylan had been his only friend even close to the same age as him. He told me he knew that he was weird. He couldn't put it into words, but he said he just couldn't interact with people properly if he tried. He apologized to me for everything he had said and done that night. He started talking like it was all over. I didn't want to watch him die. I still thought he was a tweaker, but as I saw life slowly leaving his eyes I remembered the value of it. I couldn't be the last person he ever saw. I could see the red lights flashing through the trees. I didn't know if Tiana had remembered the exact spot George had fallen, but I was determined to get him out of there. At this point, he was drifting in and out of consciousness. I bent over and slung him over my shoulder while he screamed in pain. He was extremely heavy, but I wasn't weak. I slowly made my way up the hill to the path where the ambulance came rolling down. The EMTs hopped out with a stretcher and gently took George off my back and strapped him in. They loaded him into the ambulance, and that was the last time I saw him. Dylan told us later that he made a full recovery. I was now covered in blood and freezing, but I learned something valuable that night. Of course, don't judge a book by its cover, even when the cover is screaming in glaring red that this person is a stone-cold psycho killer. However, I felt like the real lesson was that even psycho killers start off as people just like me and you. The only thing separating any of us from each other is a couple of choices. Some made by us, and some made for us. I also learned that sometimes it's better not to risk it. Even for a generational biscuit.